It was a week ago at the time. I was in college during the summer vacation, so I chose to work 2 weekdays and a weekend. I worked as a security guard at a medium-sized supermarket located in the suburbs, which operated 24 hours a day. My working hours were usually from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. the next day. My usual job was to patrol and see if there were any suspicious individuals and check if there were any issues with the facilities inside the store. One day, I was resting in the break room behind the meat section on the first floor. The break room was a dull space of about 8 square meters, with 2 cheap fluorescent lights on the ceiling, one of which was half broken, making the room dim overall. There were also several old lockers in the room, and 2 relatively spacious, but messy desks next to the windows. I was sitting in one of the chairs at the desk, drinking canned coffee and smoking to relax. Suddenly, I heard a female voice behind me say, "Oh, sorry." I turned around in surprise to see a woman standing at the door. She was wearing a plain white shirt and a simple skirt, but strangely, her face was completely black like a shadow, making it impossible to see clearly. I asked her what was wrong, and she stood there saying her 3-year-old son was missing. Following the instructions in the handbook, I first asked for the child's description and then turned on the microphone switch on the desk to make an announcement in the store. "Thank you for always visiting our supermarket. We are looking for a lost child. He is a 3-year-old boy wearing a white baseball cap and a red sports shirt. If you see him, please report to our staff." Then I repeated the announcement. I then went to the side to get the form for her to fill out. But when I turned back, the woman was gone. I wondered where she had gone. At that moment, Mr. Johnson entered the break room with a very frightening expression. Mr. Johnson was the most senior security guard in the supermarket. He came to sit next to me and asked about the appearance of the woman I had just seen. I honestly answered him. And then he said something like this: "In fact, around this time last year, there was a college student about your age working here on a late Saturday night. He was resting here just like you. Then suddenly a woman came in saying her child was missing. The woman's appearance was just like you described. The woman told the college student that her child was wearing a white baseball cap and a red sports shirt. After the college student made an announcement in the store, when he looked back, the woman had disappeared." I asked if the boy was found, but Mr. Johnson's expression turned grim. He then said the child was not found that day, but the next day, the woman came to the store again. I asked if we should call the police to help, but she said no, she wanted to find him herself. The results were fruitless. In the following days, the woman came multiple times to inquire about her child's whereabouts. Eventually, she did something. You know what? I shook my head cluelessly. Mr. Johnson sighed and said, "She eventually set herself on fire at the entrance of our supermarket, and of course, she quickly burned to death." After listening to Mr. Johnson's story, my heart started racing, and warm yet unpleasant sweat slid down my cheeks. I tightly held my trembling legs. Trying to stay calm, I stammered and said, "But I just saw," and Mr. Johnson calmly looked at me and continued. This was later learned when the police came to ask questions. The woman, a month before she first came to our supermarket to look for her son, lived with him in a house in an old residential area downtown. One day, she left her son alone at home to go shopping at the supermarket. Unfortunately, within that short period, their house caught fire and was completely destroyed. Later, the fire department investigation found matches scattered on the floor of the room, concluding that the fire was caused by her son playing with matches. His tragic condition was also found in the debris. Nearby residents told the police that since that tragedy, the woman's strange behavior began. I asked what strange behavior the woman exhibited, and Mr. Johnson replied, "Well, it's said that she repeatedly asked around the neighborhood if anyone had seen her son. Eventually, she even came to our supermarket to ask. By then, her appearance had become quite haggard, like an old woman. In the end, she did those things at the entrance of our supermarket. After Mr. Johnson finished, he looked down with a gloomy expression, then looked at me and continued, "Actually, there's one more thing. It's about what happened to the college student who worked here later. Since the woman's incident, the college student's mental state began to deteriorate, and he looked increasingly pale. Sometimes during work, he would suddenly scream and often mutter, 'He's coming, he's coming.' Eventually, about a month later, he was found dead in his apartment bed. But the terrible thing is, when he was found, his death was very strange. His whole body was almost black, and his skin was blistered." After listening to Mr. Johnson's words, I felt very scared. But the horror began after that day's work. In my apartment, the door of a certain room would always make knocking sounds, and after a while of knocking, I could always hear the woman's delicate voice saying, "My child, where is he? Please help me find my child. I can't bear it if I'm not with him." I heard her voice every day, and I could only lie helplessly on the bed by the window, covering my head with a blanket and shivering, and for a week, I was disturbed by that woman and hardly slept. Nor did I go out. I felt like my physical strength was reaching its limit, and my mind was starting to blur. And just last night, I heard a different sound, as if something was rubbing against the floor. So I cautiously looked out from the gap in the blanket toward the direction of the sound, and what I saw froze me in place. In the pale moonlight, I saw a boy wearing a white baseball cap and a red sports shirt standing there. He had an ugly, charred black face, but his eyes were innocent as he smiled at me, staring at me. I didn't know what would happen to me afterwards. Would I end up like the college student?